Granda. She's a good girl. Good girl. Woo. Sure, she'd like to be basking outside in the sun, but it's like 100 or 90 to 100 degrees outside right now, which is way too hot to want to have her outside for long periods of time. God. Sometimes it sucks living in the Midwest, particularly Nebraska right now this time of year. It is so hot, and why am I blurry? It's so hot, my camera's sweating, and it's blurry. There we go. Next up, more miscellaneous kingdoms in One Piece. So, this is going over several of the different kingdoms in One Piece that we've actually spent a little bit of time with the kingdom, or at least learned a little bit about the kingdom, beyond just, like, you know, its general location and who rules it, to a degree. I will have, the next video I will be making for this series will be about all of the different, kingdoms that were introduced specifically during Reverie. So that way it's like all these miscellaneous kingdoms for the most part. And like that's basically all that we know about them for the most part, is like the king or queen or the prince and princesses and stuff like that. Possibly the general location of it and roughly its opinion of other countries, but we'll see. But it's so freaking hot outside right now. So if I look a little flushed, that's why. It's because I was just outside giving her a walk. So, first off on this list, we have the Elysia Kingdom. Now, the Elysia Kingdom is just one of the random kingdoms that's kind of introduced when we get the flashback, when Vivi is remembering, like, her first time going to Reverie 8 years ago. So when she's talking to the Straw Hats about, like, how she knows Wapol, like, when she's remembering Wapol, and when, like, Dalton's remembering her and everything. So the Elysia Kingdom, or country, is a country in the West Blue, and it is affiliated with the world government, and it did attend this past Reverie. It also attended the Reverie 8 years ago, probably also 4 years ago. We don't know much else about it. I will note, it is from the West Blue, and we know that, I believe, Frankie is from the South Blue. But I guess there's a possibility this could be the kingdom Brooke is from, because it is from the West Blue, but we don't know enough about the kingdom or enough about, like, Brooke's past regards to what country it's from, but I just wanted to point that out. So pretty much what we know about the kingdom is that 8 years ago at Reverie, King Thalassa Lucas was the king at the time, and he was at Reverie along with Wapol and Cobra and Dalton as, like, Wapol's one of his guards at the time, and some others. And we know that at that time they were talking about Dragon and this threat that he started to accumulate or grow as the leader of the Revolutionary Army. And, you know, this is, of course, he's there when, like, Cobra yells at Wapol and everything, but there's not too much else. We don't see that much of him. He's just kind of, you know, talks about the threat that Dragon holds as, you know, this great threat. You know, it could be a great thorn in the world government side. Now, we don't know enough about him to know whether or not he was a good king or not. He at least seemed to be concerned about Dragon, but I'm sure there are a lot of kings and queens that we may actually like if we knew more about them, who saw Dragon as a threat, because they could just, you know, he's a revolutionary. We don't know if he's going to try to attack us or not. So we don't know that. At the current Reverie, or at the Reverie that just happened, they had a new king, King Caesar, who is definitely a reference back to, you know, it's Caesar or Cesar, I think is the other way of pronouncing it. And he was the king, but we don't know how long he's been king. He might have been, like, he may have overthrown, you know, the king Thalassa, whatever. May have overthrown him, or maybe he's his brother and he got, you know, he died or something. I don't know, but he's the new king. And we do see this ship that belongs to the Elysia Kingdom. And it is shown, you know, heading to Reverie and carrying, you know, the recently crowned king. I don't remember if we see King Caesar at Reverie itself, but this is like he's there. Not too much else there. The next one I wanted to point out is the Goldfish Kingdom, or the Goldfish Empire, whichever one they refer to it as. So this is just like it's a little kingdom with the princess that's a goldfish that is introduced during Ha-chan's Seafloor Stroll cover story. And it's just this cute little thing. She's in like 2 of the cover pages. It's Ha-chan got a ring that was hers back from this guy that was shipwrecked on an island, and Ha-chan gave him food and got the ring as payment. And then he takes the ring back down to the Goldfish Kingdom and gives it to the Princess Goldfish, who can apparently wear a ring. And he gives it to her, and then she thanks him by giving him this like golden trident that then he uses to kill like a sea beast and save a sea boar. So we see her in all of 2 panels. She's a cute pink goldfish. I like her. I had a goldfish when I was a kid. It got rather large and then it died. I won it at the carnival. That's my extension on that one. Next up, we have the Briss Kingdom. Now, this one got brought up a little bit more recently in the story, as in like callback to a little bit more recently in the story because of a certain portrait that got shown, so I'll get to that in a minute. So the Briss Kingdom, or at least was, I don't know if it's currently still there, but at least was located in the South Blue. And the reason that we know about it is, of course, the Saint Briss is this giant exploration ship that the Straw Hats come across when it falls out of the sky and almost lands on top of them. When the wreckage of the ship falls out of the sky and almost lands on top of them. This is the one where it's just like, so, yeah, this is that ship. And as I said, it got brought up recently because of the picture that Sanji finds in it. That kind of got brought up in the fandom recently. But so pretty much what we have for the history of this, we don't know if the Briss Kingdom is still around. I guess there's the possibility that it could still be around. I think Robin kind of knows about it, maybe, but it could have just been something that she read about. 200 years ago, books about it may have been in the Library of O'Hara, which she may have read. Or it could have just been something else that she learned about in her, time of, traveling around, when she was on the run before she ended up with Crocodile. But in regards to this, it was this kingdom in the South Blue. They sent out this ship that ended up traveling to Jaya. Now, the crew itself ended up getting shot up in the knock-up stream and landing in, at the very least, either the White Sea or the White Sea. And from what they could tell, based on the information that Robin could deduce from, the bones that she found and everything, was that they were attacked by the Skypians or the Shandorians, depending on the circumstances. And most of them ended up getting killed, and then the ones that didn't get killed in that regard were sent drifting on the clouds. Were sent to, cloud drift, which is, kind of their version of, life imprisonment, basically, because the same thing happens to, Enel's priests, except Geratsu, who lands down and somehow ends up in near Alabasta. So it's sent cloud drifting, and then that's about 200 years ago that happened, and then what happens is it falls out of the sky. About 2 years ago, it fell out of the sky, and it almost lands on top of the Going Merry. The wreckage fell almost right on top of the Going Merry, and of course that's where the Straw Hats are like, what the F, when they're on their way, when they end up heading their way to Jaya. Lands into the water, all of the debris and everything just land into the water. A skeleton and some of the debris land on top of the Merry and everything, which just scares Usopp and Chopper, which is just hilarious. And then Robin just explains, it must have fell from a sky island. And they're like, what the heck is a sky island? Which, of course, this whole thing falling is what ends up leading them to going to Skypiea in the first place. And, what ends up happening is, of course, Robin sifts through the wreckage. She finds a skull and, puts it back together. And she's like, because she's using her archaeology abilities. She's like, this man, was shot in the head, blah, 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 blah. They find this, the map that is of Skypiea that Nami then uses later to, like, piece to the map of Jaya to show that it's a skull and everything. So there's that. In the wreckage, they also find the old waver and everything. But this is when Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji end up getting dressed in these makeshift diving suits that, like, Usopp comes up with fairly on the fly. So they work pretty well for, what Usopp does. Frankie, with his knowledge, could probably make something even better now. And Usopp even now could probably make something even better than these ones. But, give them that. And they, Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji all, go down and they start looking through the wreckage. And this is where Zoro finds this, old katana that just, like, shatters as soon as he removes it from the blade. They end up finding this, an old vase that just disintegrates as soon as they touch it. They find the waver that they end up, I believe, taking back to the surface. And then, of course, that gets fixed up by Paggia. So that way Nami ends up writing it later. And then they end up finding a portrait, or Sanji finds this picture of a woman with, like, a harpoon stabbed through it. And this picture got brought up a lot more recently because of the fact that they're like, oh, well, what if this is, somehow related to Lily or something like that? Like, that concept has been around for a long time. Before it was like, oh, Sanji, it looks like someone Sanji knows. And it's just like, well, then later on we saw Sora, and it's just like, well, maybe not. And then now there's thoughts that there's maybe, like, a connection to Lily in there somewhere, to Nefertari Lily in there somewhere, which is a possibility. They end up getting, pulled back up. There's also this other point where they find, they're still down there, they find this treasure chest, and it has a lock on it, and they open it, and inside is just this feather that's just inside of it, and that's, like, the only thing that's inside the chest. And then they end up, they have to get pulled back up out of the water pretty quickly because A, they can all drown if the suits stop working. B, Luffy's a devil fruit user, so he's just stuck no matter what happens if that thing stops, if their air supply dries up, if their air supply runs out. So they eventually get pulled back up. This is, of course, where they meet Mashira and I believe Shoujo, I believe, is the other one. That is the other member of the, alliance there that's connected to Cricket, the Sariyama alliance and everything. And of course, eventually, the ship, or a good chunk of the ship itself ends up getting eaten by this giant, massive sea turtle that just pops up and is just like, oh, and then swims away. It's just funny. But this is, of course, where they start learning about what Skypiea is, or the possibility of Sky Islands and Skypiea and everything like that. And of course, this leads them to finding Cricket, and then of course they end up befriending Cricket and the rest of the Sariyama Alliance, and then they end up using the knock-up string to get knocked up into the sky, where of course it is later confirmed that, God's guards, and, explain that, we had to send them cloud drifting because they were intruders and they were trying to attack us. So that's what happens there. We don't know anything else about the Brisk Kingdom. This is about all we get. So there's the possibility that the portrait of the woman, or the picture that Sanji found, could be just like the captain's wife or sister or daughter or something like that. Could be the queen or the princess of the kingdom, and it's there because, like, they adored her back then 200 years ago. So there's questions there that can get brought up. Whoever she is may never get explained. It's just, Oda was like, I just wanted to draw a picture of a girl with a harpoon through it. That's it. That's that one. Next up, we have Flevence, or the White City. Now, to be fair, Flevence itself is not necessarily a kingdom in its own right, but it seems to be treated a bit like a city-state, kind of like how, the Vatican in Rome is like a city-state in and of its own self, and the fact that it's its own separate country, where the Pope is technically king. And there's not really many other places where I'd end up talking about Flevence anyway, so we'll talk about Flevence. So Flevence is, of course, the White City, and it was this city-state country type thing that was in the North Blue, and it, of course, where Trafalgar is from, where Law is from, and it is notable for the ability for them to mine amber lead, or the white gold that they found there. So, Um, so it is unknown if Flevens is affiliated with the world government, as during the outbreak, the royal family escaped the country and abandoned their people with the political organizations of assistance. So it could just be that the world government was just like, you give us a certain amount of money and yeah, we'll make your problem go away. And it may have been like they pleaded to, whatever, the Goro Saves, the same ones that were around right now, when this would have happened, we're like, yeah, sure, that's fine. There is a theory, though, that I think I've heard this theory from someone, that there's the possibility that maybe Saturn had something to do with the amber lead, with the white gold that was there, that maybe he's like somehow set up those deposits there at some point in the past, depending on how many centuries old he is. And then eventually it was they found the amber lead and then started mining it, and then he knew that it would like make them sick over several generations, and could have just been his effed up way of just toying with the people because he was bored. And I'm just like, that just makes you even worse. So pretty much what we have for the history of Flevens is that, so it's stated to be like straight out of like a snowy country and a fairy tale. And, it's beautiful, and there's beautiful trees and grass and flowers and everything, like all the buildings are like pure white, and it's just gorgeous and spotless and everything like that. And it supposedly left visitors wondering whether it was real or not. Like, was that wonderful city really as amazing as we thought it was? Type of a thing. And what we end up finding out is, what's revealed in, through Law's backstory. So it's also just like the whole flashbacks with like Doflamingo and everything, is that, that there was this special kind of rare ore called amber lead that they found there. And it was discovered underneath the kingdom, and they then decided to just start, that would be their source of their natural wealth and everything like that. This, this white material, and, that's why everything was like so white all around them, because everything was white. All of the buildings and materials and everything like that was white. So they started mining the amber lead, and they made quite a bit of money out of it. And this resulted in like this growth in wealth all over the country, because it allowed, because this stuff could be used in so many different things for utensils, paint, sweets, makeup, and weapons and everything like that out of this rare ore. So the city itself, the country itself, made a lot of money. And that meant that a lot of the people who were mining the ore, made a lot of money as well. So then they could pay for their children to get better educations. And this is supposedly what happens with Law's family, or it was probably something like, Law's grandfather or great grandfather were miners, and then their son, became, we know that Law's father and mother were doctors. So, it could have been, they paid so that way their children could then go and have this amazing education. And we know that Law's father was a very, very good doctor, because he was the one who actually kind of like figured up how they could cure the amber lead syndrome when it started to appear. But because he didn't have the right the right medicine or the right technique to be able to do it, it didn't happen. But Law, I think, knew about that and like used that for how he figured out how to get the amber lead out of himself. And so the country builds this great wealth. Their citizens become very, very rich. The country is very well off. And then about 13 years ago, I believe it was, through several generations, the amber lead built up in people's systems, and it was passed from parent to child to grandchild to great-grandchild over, several hundred years. Over 100 years ago in that regard. And eventually what ends up happening is, of course, the country is very well off, but it's revealed that, and this is what makes it even more effed up, is that the royalty of the country, like, had this stuff tested, and they figured out that, this is going to poison all of our citizens that are the ones mining everything. And like all of the stuff that are exposed to it, this is going to make them sick, and it's going to not just poison them, it's going to poison their children and grandchildren and such, and it's just going to make it horrible, and it's going to kill them all. So should we do something about that, or should we just continue living in our life of luxury and enjoying all of this stuff? And they just chose to enjoy the money that they got from it, which is horrible. Which is bad. And they, so they keep a lot of the wealth for themselves and everything, and they continue to sell this stuff all over the world. Now, I don't know if there's a process that they would put it to make it just like other people who are exposed to this stuff, like that use it in the weapons or the makeup or the whatever, that they wouldn't get sick. So that's a little bit left up for debate. But what ends up happening is, of course, eventually this huge, what appears to be an outbreak of this sickness, happens all over the country because everybody gets sick with it at about the same time. And, so it's all of these doctors and everything are trying to figure out what's going on. And it's like people all over the world are like reading about this in the newspaper, finding out about this, and they're, blah, 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 blah. And as I said, like the royals of the country, like leave. And then like all of the neighboring countries, for fear of getting this disease and because it's contagious, they basically end up, quarantining off the entire kingdom of Flevent, or the White City and everything, just quarantining everything off. And while this is happening, the citizens are suffering because they can't get the proper medical treatment because it's something that is literally like in their bodies that can't be just like, extracted out of them easily enough. Now, as I stated, Law's father seemed to have figured out a way of how to, fix this to a degree, but it wasn't enough that he... Like, if Law's father had access to the opopnomy, he may have been able to figure out very quickly about, like, oh, I can pull all of this out of the citizens by putting them all in a room and then, like, pulling all of the amber lead out of them, and then they'll be cured. Now, eventually it is determined, that doesn't happen, obviously, because what ends up happening is all of the other countries, and possibly some help from the world government, end up basically invading Flevent and just slaughtering the entire population of Flevent. Just destroys the entire kingdom, slaughters everyone, and they say that it's justified because they don't want this sickness, this amber lead syndrome, to go and end up, infecting other people, other places, and, people and populations and everything like that. So they use it as like this justified cause why they're able to do this. And this is horrible. And, in the episode and in the chapters where we read about this, for Law's flashback, that's just horrible. And I figured that I read, when I was reading through this, when I was like looking up stuff here, I'm just like, I was trying to remember, like, well, we know that Law's parents get killed because, like, I think we kind of see that happen, but I was just like, what happened to Lamy? Because I couldn't remember what happened to Law's sister. I know that she died. I just couldn't remember how. I couldn't remember if she died, like, on the bed because of the amber lead syndrome before, like, in her hospital bed before everything happened, or what, or if she was, killed by one of the soldiers. And it was just like, no, the hospital burned down and she was still in it. And I'm just like, oh, that's very not good. I don't like that. That's bad. Although there's lots of stuff out there where it's just like, well, what if Lamy had lived? And I'm like, well, depending on circumstances, that all depends on how Doflamingo would have treated her. In that regard, is a question there. Which, Law losing Lamy might be one of the reasons why he ends up kind of like bonding with like Baby Five, and such. Like he kind of has that bit of brother-sister rapport with her while they're kids growing up in the Don Quixote family together, and then of course, now I guess they would have a fine relationship since she is an ally of the Straw Hats because she's married to Sai. But that's that. In regards to the legacy of Flevent, obviously the main legacy is, of course, Trafalgar D. Water Law, or just Trafalgar Law, Surgeon of Death, as he is known by the world at large, depending on how widespread news of his defeat goes, at the hands of Blackbeard, and wherever the heck he currently is now, after being saved by Beppo. So he was the only known survivor of the crisis, of what happens there. He managed to smuggle himself out by hiding in the body and the corpses that were being taken over the border, and he managed to sneak his way out, which is just effing horrible. So freaking horrible. And he eventually, this is where he starts to develop just his desire to, like, just destroy. He wants to destroy the world that destroyed his. It's like, he's just so bitter and everything, and of course this leads him to, of course, becoming, joining the Don Quixote family and everything else, and being around Doflamingo, and of course, being around Rocinante, and then of course eventually this results in, of course, him gaining the powers of the Op No Mi because of Rocinante's sacrifice, and then Law is able to use that, his devil fruit power to then, remove all of the amber lead from himself, and then he's able to cure himself. Now, there is the question, and it's kind of, I guess, something that can be brought up a little bit, and I'm going to bring it up here a little bit, is in regards to the Op No Mi. We don't know who the previous user of it was. We know that there had to have been one because, it only came into, circulation recently when when Law was a child, about 13 years ago, I believe, is when all of this happens. When the whole, when Law's flashback happens with Rocinante and everything. Is, I believe, about 13 years ago. And what ends up happening is, they get the Op No Mi from, they get it from, Diaz barrels and everything on Minion Island. And, that's unfortunately when Rocinante dies and all of that stuff. But there is the question of who had it before Law. Now, obviously, there's the theories now of, like, because it can do this, perennial youth operation where, you live as long as you can, as long as you're not, stabbed or poisoned or starved or whatever, you will live and live and live and live, which I had a whole video where I talked about the horrors of, like, if you're immortal, if you're nigh on immortal, and whatever caveats come with that. But what ends up happening, or, there's the theory that, like, that's what happened with Eam, or the Gorosei, like, that the Op No Mi is involved with that. And while that may be very well and true, it means that the devil fruit has gone in and out of circulation at various points in time. And there is the question of, like, well, who had it before Law? Because that person must have died recently. Maybe they were an amazing doctor, and had they been able to get their way to Flevence, they may have been able to heal everybody anyway. So there's the possibility that, that could have been a possibility, that had they, had Flevence and had the royalty of Flevence actually freaking cared about their citizens instead of just their own wealth and their own lives and livelihood and everything like that, had they actually cared, then they could have found the person who had the Op No Mi, and if they were an amazing doctor, then just, hire the doctor to come to Flevence and, heal everybody. There's also the question of, well, what would Vegapunk have done with it? Because I don't know if Vegapunk would know. I mean, like, we saw him be able to cure Bonnie's sapphire scales. Cure that with basically, like, stem cell type things. Stem cell replacement. So there's the question of, like, would Vegapunk been able to have, cured the Amber Lead syndrome that was affecting everybody in the White City? I guess that is a question, but there's also, at that time, Vegapunk was a world government scientist. He was working for the Marines and for the Gorosei and all of that stuff. So if Flevence wasn't super aligned with the world government, then they wouldn't have had a reason to be able to get him to go there. And it could have been also, like, the sickness came on so quickly that they're just like, oh, we'll just let him die, it's fine, because they had horrible royalty. So there's those questions there of, like, what, would Vegapunk have been able to do anything to stop what had happened with the Amber Lead syndrome, to maybe not prevent what happened, but at the very least be able to cure most of the people? That's a possibility, but again, we don't know. It's a thought. It would be interesting to get, okay. Side note here. I don't know if it's known that Law, beyond, like, outside of, like, the people who are in the Doflamingo family, the Don Quixote family, whether or not, how well known it is that Law was the sole survivor of Flevens. Like, is that something that, like, the world government knows, that, like, Cypherpol knows, that, like, you know, Big News Morgans knows? Would they be aware of that information? It may not necessarily make that much of a difference, but it would have been interesting to see, you know, kind of like the alternate path idea of, like, well, what if Law had ended up at Egghead? Would Law had ended up, you know, in meeting Vegapunk and everything? Like, would Law have asked Vegapunk something about, you know, asked him about what, you know, about the Amber Lead syndrome and get his opinions of it? I mean, I guess that could still, in a form, happen where, like, if Law somehow meets Lilith, and Lilith may have information about that, that would be an interesting way of Lilith going, yeah, we found out about that later on, and, you know, after it happened, or shortly after it happened, but, you know, after the massacre happened, or whatever the case would be, and, you know, Vegapunk, you know, the Stella wanted to try to see if there would be a way to try to fix it, but because of everything, we couldn't get our hands on any of the material to be able to study it or anything like that. So that's a possibility there. But then again, Vegapunk did kind of go against the rules of the world government and end up reading a ton of the books from O'Hara, and has clearly traveled to Elbath in regards to meeting with Saul there and reading the books that they saved from O'Hara. So there's that. And a little bit of trivia in regard to Flevens. So Flevens seems to share several traits with Casale Monferrato. I probably butchered that. I apologize. They are both nicknamed the White City, and they've both developed an industry centered around mining the use of toxic materials. Specifically in regards to the real-world equivalent was asbestos. And yeah, if you've seen anything about, like, commercials about, like, were you exposed to asbestos or blah 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 blah, yeah, it's not good. Asbestos is very bad, which of course results in the death of a lot of the people who are exposed to it. So the thing that I point out in regards to similarities between, like, Amber Lead syndrome and, like, asbestos in this regard, but also something else that is very prevalent in our world, are these forever chemicals. So the Amber Lead, as is explained by, I believe it's explained by Gladius in One Piece when he's talking with Baby 5 in the flashback. He explains how first it's, you know, the grandparent that's affected by it and gets it into their system, and then it goes down the family line, and then it'll actually end up appearing in all of them at the same time. You know, grandfather, you know, great grandfather to grandfather to son to grandson, or, you know, grandparent grandchild setup, and it will get passed down, and it will shorten each of their lifespans, but it won't show up until, like, at the same moment. And that's why it appeared to be something that was an outbreak of, like, a plague or something like that. And in our world, there is asbestos and other types of chemicals like lead and different things like that obviously are bad to get into your system, because they can frickin' F up your body and kill you. If you're exposed to too much of it. I remember having to be tested for, like, you know, like lead paint poisoning when I was a kid, because, like, the house that had my daycare in it was, like, an older house, and they needed to test the kids, and not fun, but I was one of the older ones there, and it's just like, you have to set a good example for the other kids, and I'm like, F you. You know, I was like, I can do this, as they're, like, you know, pricking your finger to get the sample, which hurt like heck, but it's like, okay, I have to be brave, or everybody else is going to be screaming their heads off more, so I can do this. I was like 9, I don't remember, but it wasn't fun, I know that. We didn't have lead poisoning, thankfully, but, you know, it's just to put an end to that one, I didn't have lead poisoning, but there's also, like, forever chemicals today that are, like, different types of things that are in, like, plastics and things like that, you know, plastics and Teflon and different things like that, you know, stay in your system, like the microplastics that end up in the ocean, and then fish eat them, and then humans eat the fish, and then the microplastics that are in the fish ends up in humans. So, it's not a new concept. Not a new concept at all. Next up, we got one other kingdom to talk about for this list, and we learned about this kingdom fairly recently, and we got the flashback about it fairly recently in the English dub of the anime. And that is the Vodka Kingdom, aka the homeland of Kaido. Yeah. So, what we know about the Vodka Kingdom is that it was, at least it was, whether or not it's still around is left up for debate. It was located somewhere in the Grand Line. Whether or not it's on the New World or the Paradise side is a little bit left up for debate, but it was somewhere in the Grand Line. And the general information is that pretty much what we have for that and the history of it is that the kingdom itself mostly ended up going and attacking other kingdoms to take their resources and the food and money and everything like that, and then use that for their own means, and to like be able to like barely cover like the heavenly tribute and everything like that. And they're forced to wage wars against other countries and then loot them. And of course this resulted in a lot of, child soldiers, one of them being Kaido. And when he, so as he's growing up, he's, turns into this, child soldier and has to, he fights and fights and fights because that's all he knows. And, he's like this like one-man wrecking crew that they have, and so they're able to use him to get a lot of the resources and treasure and loot and everything like that they need to, pay for the heavenly tribute. And then eventually what ends up happening is, of course, the Vodka Kingdom about 49-ish years ago, they decide that they are going to, or about 46-ish years ago, they decide that they are going to basically trade Kaido to the Marines in order to be fully made members of the world government and be able to gain a spot at the next reverie. And that doesn't go well to a degree. We see in the flashback that we get for Kaido, which is of course just the only information we know about the Vodka Kingdom is from Kaido's flashback, is, we see Kaido bound in chains and being dragged away by the Marines against his will, as they're like, you'll become an amazing Marine, and, this is the, best way to help our kingdom, and blah, 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 blah. As we see, like, the king sitting on his throne. And eventually, Kaido gets dragged away, and he ends up on the Marine ship, and he basically ends up just, snapping the chains and escaping. Because at that point in time, he doesn't have a devil fruit, so he can just dive into the ocean and swim away with, like, with his kanabo, like, between his teeth as he's, like, swimming away or something like that. And then he just subsequently would, he lets himself get captured again and again and again, so that way he can just eat any food on the ship and then leave again. Plus he gets bored, and then eventually that's, he joins the Rocks Pirates and everything like that, and then of course that leads to devil fruit and everything else. But at the most recent reverie, we didn't see any Vodka Kingdom representatives, or at least none of them were named. Now, bear in mind, this was 46 years ago, and their, countries can probably fall out of favor with the world government and be disinvited to the reveries if they're not contributing enough or have enough status in, I guess, their home regions or something, and the different, in one of the four blues or in the Grand Line or something like that. So there is this, concept where, like, they may have been at one of the reveries and then just subsequently, like, they couldn't keep up with being able to, be useful members of, the world government, productive members, and they may have just been either kicked out of the reverie or just kicked out of the world government altogether. Because, like, I made, like, a list, I think, of, like, all the countries that we know that are associated with the world government at this exact moment, because some of them have fallen in and out of favor, or because, like, as I said, we don't know if the Brisk Kingdom is associated with the world government. And Flevens will have had a loose association. They may not have been, members of the reverie or anything like that. And their royalty is, like, scattered to the winds at this point in time. But, the Vodka Kingdom, may have been part of reverie at some point in time. may have been part of this last reverie. We just don't know, because even out of all the kings and queens and everything like that we were introduced to, there were a lot of them that we didn't get names from, or even the name of the country that they were from, or one or the other. Or we don't even get anything like a name or a country that's associated with them. So there's a possibility that they were at the reverie, we just didn't know it. I don't expect the Vodka Kingdom to really be brought back up again. But I will point out that since that's where Kaido was from, and he has Oni blood in him, and depending on whether or not the Oni blood is like possibly a recessive trait or something like that doesn't always pop up in every generation, Kaido had it and Yamato had it, so there's the possibility that like Yamato's mother had Oni genes as well, if they are recessive genes. But since we don't know, dominant and recessive genes in One Piece, and with anime, when it comes to dominant and recessive genes, don't even ask. Don't even think about trying to figure out what's considered dominant and recessive when it comes to anime genetic explanations. Kind of like with the fishmen and merfolk genetics. It's like, it's a lottery what you're going to end up looking like in that regard. So there's that. Same thing with like the minks, where it's just like, it's a lottery what you're going to look like, and then like you combine some of that stuff together and you don't know what you're going to get. That would be interesting if someone was like a quarter mink, a quarter Oni, a quarter fishman, and like a quarter, I don't know, human or something. That would be like a very interesting combination of whatever the heck you would look like. I don't know. That's a possibility, but I don't know. But I doubt the Vodka Kingdom's going to get brought back up. In regards to just like some of the trivia about it, obviously vodka is this alcoholic beverage from Eastern Europe, very popular in Russia and in Ukraine and other areas like that. And this fits with Kaido, loving alcohol and being an alcoholic and everything like that. And I guess there's like a joke there where like part of like the Japanese pronunciation of vodka ties into like Kaido's laugh of war, in that regard, for just like how it's set up, and like I guess a pun in regards to how it lines up for what his devil fruit is, with his uanomi, for that one. So there's some connections there, I guess, but we don't know that much about that. So those were those 4 kingdoms, and I'm blurry again. Come on, make me not blurry again. I'm almost done with this. So the next one for this series will be me talking about the different kingdoms that we know that are specifically, that were either introduced at the reverie itself, or we don't really know that much about them and they're just connected to the reverie. Now, Elysia was one of the ones that we know is connected to the reverie, but I figured I'd throw it in here since we know a little bit more about it. Not much, but a little bit more. And then for some of the ones that will have their own separate videos, as I said, the Protons Kingdom for Lisabella II, that one will have its own separate video for this. And then Lelucia will have its own separate video as well. Because we know enough about those kingdoms, or at least people from those kingdoms, that I wanted to talk about them separately. So that's what I have for this. I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day. And if you're in an area where it is so freaking hot, please remember to drink water and try to stay cool. Okay, bye.